Subcommittee will come to order. The chair again welcomes Administrator Babbitt and also General Scovel to the subcommittee hearing today. Administrator Babbitt, let me say that I am frustrated, as are family members and others, with the time that it is taking to move forward with some of the provisions in our bill in H.R. 3371 in the time that it's taken the FAA to work through the process. Now, having said that, let me say that I have worked with a number of administrators over the past 21 years, and I have said, I spoke to an organization this morning and said that I believe that we have an administrator now that is trying to move the agency forward and to do the right thing. I hope that in your testimony, and I've had a chance to review it, that you will address some of the issues as to why it's taking the time that it is taking, and to talk a little bit about where we go from here. So with that, the chair now recognizes Administrator Babbitt.
Well, thank you, Chairman Costello, Congressman Petri, members of the subcommittee. And first, I appreciate your confidence and your opening statement. I also would like to thank you for inviting me here today to provide you with an update on the FAA's call to action on airline safety and pilot training. Given the recent NTSB hearing on the Colgan accident, and this being the one-year anniversary of that tragedy, this gathering is especially timely. One of the misconceptions that I'd like to address this morning is that the FAA's actions are either ineffective or insufficient. And I really believe this is a disservice to the hardworking safety professionals who have been working tirelessly on these as well as other safety issues. Obviously, since I've become the administrator, I have seen firsthand how dedicated the FAA workforce actually is. And I've also spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out what I can do to promote a better, more accurate understanding of what we do and the safety impact that it actually has. I'm well aware that there's always room for improvement as well, but the vehemence of the criticism the FAA receives does not comport with the safety statistics. I believe that one reason for this misconception is that the FAA seems to be measured primarily by how long it takes us to issue and finalize rulemakings. And while I appreciate the importance of regulations, and the rulemaking process is a deliberative one, and that, by definition, can take quite a bit of time, I think the criticism also fails to take into account the many other tools that the FAA has that result often in relatively immediate safety improvements. And Secretary LaHood and I announced the call to action last year. One of the repeated criticisms that I heard were we were not compelling action. We were requesting voluntary action. And I think I attempted to make clear at that point we were working to build a consensus on what should be done to improve safety and professionalism, and ask the industry and all the professionals to work together to get it done as soon as possible. And I explained at that time that requesting voluntary action was, in my opinion, the fastest way to move forward, and I wanted the most immediate results that I could get. I also told the committee that I thought the best approach for receiving faster results was to achieve consensus and move forward on those wherever possible. And I sensed some skepticism at that time, and I've continued to get complaints that we failed to live up to our initial goals. But again, I'm concerned that no one is taking into account the benefits detailed in our final report that we actually have achieved and the progress that we have made. Chairman Overstar charged me to use my bully pulpit, if you would, to influence actions of the industry, and that's exactly what I tried to do. In the aftermath of the call to action, the FAA initiated a two-part focused inspection of air carrier flight crew member training, qualification, and management practices. FAA inspectors observed 2,419 training and check events during the evaluation. At the start of the evaluation, 76 carriers had systems that complied with remedial training requirements. 15 carriers had some component of remedial training, and 8 carriers didn't have any remedial training provisions whatsoever. They lacked any component of remedial training, and they were therefore identified by us as having greater risk, and therefore they warranted additional scrutiny. Today, 7 months after the call to action, all carriers that were evaluated today have some component of remedial training. With respect to FOQA, we now have, again, 7 months after the call to action, we now have 11 new carriers that have adopted FOQA programs since July of 2009, and one application is currently pending. Similarly, all 3 of the carriers that did not have any ASAP reporting programs, all 3 now have an ASAP for at least one employee group in place, and 4 other carriers have established additional ASAP programs for additional pilot groups. We also ask air carriers to meet with their smaller partner airlines to exchange safety practices and encourage the adoption of best practices. FAA is encouraging the carriers. They're doing it, and we're encouraging them to continue to meet with their partner airlines periodically and to ensure a continuous exchange of information. And as I sit here today, I am pleased to tell you this is currently happening now at all scheduled airline carriers that have regional partners. In addition, the ATA Safety Council has now included the safety directors from the National Air Carriers Association as well as the Regional Airline Association in their quarterly meetings. There are many other examples of recent accomplishments that I hope to mention during the course of this hearing, but I would like to announce the agency's advance notice of proposed rulemaking on crew training requirements, which was posted today on the Federal Register's website this morning. I look forward to hearing from the industry and the public on the range of issues that we need to consider as we move forward. As I have stated repeatedly, there is a difference in my mind between knowing that a pilot has been exposed to all critical situations during targeted training versus assuming that simply flying more hours automatically will provide that exposure. Unlike some things in life, safety is not a game. It doesn't have a goal line. We reach one goal only to set out for a new one. Safety professionals do not cross a goal line and claim victory. We're forever searching ways, new ways, to advance safety through technical and procedural improvements, as well as through a continued emphasis on professionalism. And just because the final report on the call to action was issued doesn't mean that our efforts will stop. No one should assume that. They shouldn't even assume they'll slow down. I've been very gratified with the response that I've received to this effort, and I think the collective efforts of the FAA, the airlines, the labor unions involved, and of course our friends here in Congress will continue to work together, and I'm certain that it'll result in implementing advanced best practices, transferring pilot experience, and achieving an overall improvement in airline safety. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my remarks, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have or the committee.
Thank you, Administrator Babbitt. And the Chair now recognizes the Inspector General for the Department of Transportation, General Scovel.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Petri, members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me here today to discuss the status of FAA's efforts to improve air carrier safety. After last year's Colgan accident, FAA took swift action by creating its call to action plan. FAA has made progress in implementing the plan's 10 initiatives, including holding safety forums across the country. However, progress has been slow in implementing initiatives with the greatest potential to improve safety, specifically those related to pilot fatigue, training, and professionalism, and efforts to strengthen air carriers' voluntary safety programs. My testimony today focuses on concerns related to these initiatives. To address concerns about pilot fatigue, FAA established a special rulemaking committee to propose new crew rest requirements. The committee met its September 2009 deadline. However, FAA missed its milestone to issue an NPRM by December 2009 and now plans to issue it this spring. However, if passed as prologue, the new rule could be years in the making. Numerous attempts to update these requirements, which were last modified in the 1980s, have failed due to disagreements among FAA, airlines, and pilot unions. FAA is facing similar challenges with revising crew training requirements. FAA issued an NPRM on the new requirements over a year ago and received over 3,000 pages of comments. FAA now plans to issue a supplemental notice in the very near future. At the same time, FAA's reviews of air carriers' flight crew training and qualification programs lacked the rigor needed to assess effectiveness. We question the thoroughness of these reviews, in part because FAA did not provide specific review criteria to inspectors, many of whom had never before assessed remedial training programs for pilots. FAA surveillance questions also raised concerns, as a number were not relevant to many air carrier operations. Moreover, some questions were not comprehensive enough to detect flaws in training programs. For example, while inspectors observed more than 2,400 pilot evaluation and training events, there were no questions on whether pilots completed the evaluations successfully, a key measure of a training program's effectiveness. FAA has also been slow to address concerns regarding a lack of pilot professionalism, an issue raised by NTSB in 4 of the last 6 fatal accidents involving regional airlines. To better ensure pilots adhere to professional standards and flight discipline, FAA plans to implement a mentoring program. However, FAA has not specified how or when it will accomplish this. While professionalism cannot be mandated, FAA can take actions, such as expediting training and fatigue rulemakings and facilitating communication between mainline and regional air carriers that would directly impact pilot performance. Another key goal of FAA's call to action is to expand regional carrier participation in voluntary safety efforts in areas such as pilot records and voluntary safety programs. While FAA requested commitments from air carriers, its progress toward this initiative has been mixed. Specifically, 80 carriers responded to FAA's request for safety improvements, but many were vague as to the actions they plan to take and their timelines, and 14 did not commit to expand their pilot record review during the hiring process. With regard to FOQA and ASAP, the most important voluntary safety programs, 22 carriers responded that they did not plan to implement FOQA, and 8 stated they would not implement ASAP. While cost, equipment availability, and fleet size present significant obstacles for smaller regional air carriers to implement voluntary safety programs, FAA has not presented any plans to encourage carriers to establish these important safety programs. Further, FAA failed to follow up with carriers to ensure their planned actions will effectively meet safety goals or that the carriers will set completion milestones. FAA also did not follow up with those carriers that submitted vague responses or no response at all. Yet FAA concluded this initiative achieved its intended outcome. Before closing, I'd like to note other critical safety concerns highlighted during hearings after the Colgan crash, but not addressed in the call to action plan. These include pilot domicile, differences in pilot training and hiring, and pilot experience and pay. These issues present significant challenge for FAA, Congress, and industry stakeholders in determining the nature and extent of actions needed. At the request of Congress, we are reviewing the potential impact these issues have on pilot safety and plan to report our findings later this year. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement. I'd be happy to answer any questions you or members of the subcommittee may have.
Thank you, General Scovel. Let me ask you to elaborate on one of the final points that you made. You indicated in your testimony that while the FAA received written responses from 80 of the 98 carriers, many were only partial commitments or no commitment at all. In addition, we found many carriers' responses were either vague and lacked detail as to actions needed, and timelines are stated that they did not intend to take any action. I guess, Mr. Scovel, before I ask you to elaborate, I'd ask Mr. Administrator Babbitt to respond.
Yes, sir. The response that we got, I think we need to be cautious with the numbers that we're talking about. That 82% represents 99% of all the passengers carried in this country. Also, FOQA is a program of gathering data, comparing it across a fleet, and looking for trends. That's the purpose of FOQA. If you only have 1 or 2 aircraft in a fleet, bluntly speaking, the logbooks provide that trend for you. You don't need to gather data. And so what we have seen, the experience of the carriers not participating is, for the most part, people who have very small fleets or older airplanes that simply don't have the capability to provide that data in a digital format to be gathered.
Would you agree with that, General Scovel?
Mr. Chairman, I'll acknowledge the validity of Mr. Babbitt's statement that their air carrier commitment initiative covers the huge majority of aircraft in operation in the country today. Our point has to do mainly with FAA's lack of a follow-up effort in response to the air carrier commitments. What the administrator had asked for was that for all recipients of his request to respond to him, and of the 80 who responded, our analysis showed, with respect to the most important efforts of that request, pilot records, 14 carriers either didn't commit or submitted letters that did not state their intention on this issue. One carrier stated that it already had a rigorous pilot selection process, and another carrier stated that it complied with PREA, which in fact was not the subject of the substance of the administrator's request. One carrier, most interestingly, remarked to us when my team was on site at their location that while they appreciated the FAA's desire to expand pilot records review for utility during the hiring process, they wondered why FAA purged records of accidents and incidents at the 5-year mark, because that carrier thought that that information might be valuable to it in making hiring decisions. Now, we realize that there may be statutory or regulatory requirements to purge records at designated intervals, but recognizing that carriers may be hungry for that information, we would encourage the agency to do what it could to honor their request. With regard to voluntary safety programs, FOQA being one, 25 of the 80 carriers responded to the agency that they did not plan to implement, or they gave a non-specific response. Again, we would expect, given the importance of FOQA to aircraft aviation safety, acknowledging that NTSB just this week recommended that FAA mandate the implementation of FOQA in all carriers, we would expect the agency to follow up with those carriers that submitted insufficient responses. With respect to ASAP, 11 carriers total signaled to the administrator that they did not plan to implement or submitted non-specific responses. Again, ASAP has been held up by FAA as a key cornerstone of aviation safety, and its record among the major carriers has been quite good. We would expect the agency to follow up, even down to the smallest carrier, in an attempt to further increase every aspect of aviation safety. Finally, with regard to contract provisions, and this was the question that the administrator asked, does the carrier have procedures in place to ensure that regional and mainline carriers are sharing best safety practices to the extent there's a partnership between them? 15 carriers either did not respond or submitted unclear responses. Again, we would hope that the agency would follow up.
You know, just a few weeks ago, I heard an interview, someone interviewing President Obama, and he was asked to grade himself on his first year in office. Let me ask you to grade the FAA. You've talked about some positive things, some negative things, some challenges. What grade would you give the FAA at this point on the call to action?
On the call to action, sir, as our statement makes clear, we would regard it with mixed success. If you were to press me for an actual grade, and I've resisted that in hearings in the past, I would have to tell you, sir, that I would rate it incomplete. I certainly wouldn't grade it pass-fail at this point because, as Mr. Babbitt has acknowledged, very much needs to be done. I couldn't rate it an A, a B, or even a C. I'd have to give it an incomplete at this point. I do want to acknowledge that FAA, and under Mr. Babbitt's leadership, has signaled an intent to engage on two of the most important initiatives, and that is the rulemaking having to do with fatigue and the rulemaking having to do with crew training. On fatigue, sir, we're in a fix. As you pointed out in your opening statement, we're working now under a rule that was promulgated in 1985 based on medical science that's even older than that. Since that rule was issued, much medical research has been done by FAA itself and by NASA at the request of the Congress and funded accordingly. Yet the current rule doesn't incorporate that. Despite the effort in 1995, which met vociferous resistance from the industry, FAA in the intervening years, 15 years until Mr. Babbitt arrived, chose not to engage on this front. I give great credit to Mr. Babbitt for signaling publicly in the call to action that he's going to press home on fatigue and crew training requirements. That said, as our statement makes clear, we would take issue with how FAA designed, implemented, and follow through on a number of its initiatives, to include attention to the professionalism matter. The initiative attempted to do that through mentoring. Second, the air carrier commitment to its most effective practices. I discussed that in the last question, sir. And finally, on the focused inspection initiative, which yielded, we think, some important information for the agency, but because of flaws in the design and implementation, and specifically some lack of guidance to key inspectors who were designated to carry it out, lost some of its impact. So for those reasons, sir, I'd have to give it an incomplete grade at this point, recognizing that there's room to improve and time to do so.
I thank you. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Petri.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think the Inspector Scovel in his testimony made reference to the fact that in 4 of the last 6 fatal accidents, there was a lack of pilot professionalism and performance that was cited as a contributory factor. And I'd like to ask Administrator Babbitt what is in the works to deal with that problem.
Thank you. As I stated in my testimony, in our call to action, one of the things we did, we had 12 meetings around the country that were well attended. And from those, we also called in both the air carriers themselves as well as the pilot unions. I've already had 1 meeting just with the leadership of the pilot unions, representing about 95% of all the commercial pilots in this country. We're scheduled for another meeting next week. It took a long time, and I do appreciate the concern that some of these things are moving less quickly than some would like. But I'd have to remind everybody, the industry didn't get to this state. The industry didn't devolve into the state of where we see serious gaps in professionalism and attention in the cockpit overnight. It took years, and it's going to take us years to bring it back. And I'm pleased to tell you that I have had a wonderful response. I could cite, and if you'd like, I would submit for the record. I received a report from the Airline Pilots Association of a group. They have now done a university outreach program. I have with me here, this is the Independent Pilots Association, the pilots that fly for UPS. This is a special publication issue devoted entirely to professionalism. On the back is the Code of Professionalism. This was never printed or circulated before this. Several of the carriers have done this. I've been asked to submit pieces to several different individual pilot unions to put a piece in on professionalism, and they're welcoming that. So I would say we have gotten their attention, and I would say they're taking very, very proactive actions, recognizing, working with us, and working with their companies. So I'm actually very pleased, and to be candid, it's difficult for me to understand why people can't see some of the positive actions that are resulting from this.
Well, I certainly would agree that we need to be focusing on and working hard for years to maintain professional standards in the cockpit, but I hope it doesn't take years to achieve those standards, because people are going to be flying in the meantime, and we want them to be flying under professional conditions. And
well, in addition, I've had, if I may, the carriers have indicated, several of them, that are working with their pilot groups to revise the transition training when a pilot goes from being a senior first officer to a captain, and refresher training for captains as well as the transition to enforce professionalism, that it's their duty, it's their obligation, and it's something like you see in a lot of places. Sometimes people just have to be reminded and the training revised to put it in front and center of them, and I'm pleased to see both carriers and their pilot groups recognizing that and working together to help achieve overall safety.
General Scovel, we've been wrestling with the area of sterile cockpit rules here. The violation of those rules have been a notable factor in both the Lexington and Buffalo accidents, and have prompted the National Transportation Safety Board to recommend the FAA take action to prevent further violations of those rules. What specific steps might be taken to step up enforcement of sterile cockpit conditions?
You raise a very interesting point, Mr. Petri, because while it's often said that professionalism cannot be mandated, and I fully agree with that, it's a concept. When you to take apart that concept and recognize that there are discrete behaviors, whether they relate to fitness for duty, training, the obligation to behave professionally in the cockpit. Those discrete behaviors can be regulated, not to say that they always should be. Sometimes the voluntary or consensus method is the way to go, and those should always be impressed and reinforced using that. But sometimes enforcement methods should be in place. I'm not in a position now because I don't have a body of work, frankly, on which to speak. But I would say that we have instances that are common knowledge where we can say that some enforcement methods have been put in place. For instance, it's a professional pilot will not report to work under the influence of alcohol. Do we rely on the judgment of that individual to sustain that standard? No, we've got a bottle to throttle rule. The professional pilot doesn't report for work, overly fatigued. Again, do we rely on individual initiative or judgment? No. For the benefit of that pilot and his employer or her employer, we have crew rest requirements. There are a number of other actions. When we get to sterile cockpit, that's going to be a tough one. NTSB, in its Colgan report just this week, tried to address these points when it recommended to FAA workload management training, leadership training, and a complete ban by the carriers, and that ban would be required by FAA on personal electronic devices in the cockpit. Those are the kind of enforcement reactions that can occasionally be necessary. I would urge this analytical framework if we were contemplating enforcement. What is the nature of the problem? What's the extent of the problem? What's the danger to safety if the problem continues? What all alternatives are there to address it? Disadvantages and advantages to those alternatives? My office and GAO, a few others in government, can help this committee and the Secretary identify those, and it becomes a policy question thereafter.
I thank you. Mr. Petri had to go to vote in another committee. He will return very shortly. Let me just comment, and then I will call on other members to ask questions. Administrator Babbitt, you indicated that we didn't get where we are overnight, and it may take years to bring it back. I understand we didn't get where we are overnight, but I don't agree that it's going to take years to get us back. And that's one of the reasons why we introduced H.R. 3371, because of our fear that it would take so long through the rulemaking process to address some of these issues. And we're not just talking about the ATP, the requirement for additional hours. It's both the qualitative training and experience needed to be a pilot. And you've covered that many times. But in our legislation, we provide comprehensive pre-employment screening of pilots, including assessment of skills, aptitude, airmanship, suitability for functioning in the airline's operational environment. We raise the minimum requirement, of course, to the ATP, which there is some disagreement on, but there are a number of other things that pilots must receive training and function effectively in an air carrier operational environment, adverse weather conditions, including icing, high-altitude operations, and multi-pilot crew. Those are things that need to be addressed, and that should not take years to bring us back. And that's why we acted so quickly to introduce this legislation after this tragedy. And that's why we did it in a bipartisan way and passed it through the committee and through the House of Representatives. Unfortunately, it's been pending over in the other body, like many other things, and we hope that very shortly they will take this legislation up too, so that we can hammer out whatever differences we may have and come up with a bill that addresses many of the needs that need to be addressed sooner rather than later, and I think you agree with that. With that, the chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Titus. Ms. Titus went to vote in another committee, I am told, so she will return. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Showers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Thank you, gentlemen, for testifying. I have two very distinct and different questions, and the first one I'd ask if Mr. Babbitt, you could take just a short amount of time to address. My district in Battle Creek, Michigan, is a home of Western Michigan University's College of Aviation. I think the finest university-based pilot training program. How are the call to actions recommendations integrated into university pilot training programs? And will today's notice of proposed rulemaking provide them an opportunity to offer alternatives? And you can both respond to that briefly if you'd like.
Yes, sir. The several fronts, multiple components of that to answer. Number one, as I indicated, several of the pilot associations have started an outreach so that you can begin to train young pilots in the value of professionalism and have living examples right in the classroom, doing guest speaking appearances, helping with the curriculum. I know several of the pilot organizations are part of a board that sets curriculum, and so we've encouraged that, and I'm pleased to see that they're actually engaging in that. Second, the proposed rulemaking that we have out, the advance notice, certainly recognizes the variance, and I would note here for the record that we were discussing this prior to the point in time when people began to focus on this. I was concerned myself that a commercial pilot's license was not sufficient training or previous qualifications, having a lot of light shown from this accident and others, that I felt we needed to improve. So we've tripled the number of hours in our proposal. I think we're at 750 hours, and we add a number of very key elements so that a pilot would be trained. Today we have high-fidelity simulation. The schools can teach the academic side of it. Pilots today come out with training and academic exposure to management of energy. These are large machines, hundreds of thousands of pounds, and stopping them on a runway requires some knowledge of how you manage all this energy. All of these things are in the curriculum. We've not ruled out anything, and perhaps one of the solutions is more time or more training interchangeably, but we certainly offer and welcome the academic community to comment for us.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Being from Michigan, as you know, we nearly had a terrible tragedy over Detroit on Christmas. I know our time is very limited, and your testimony talks about accidents and airline safety. There are other serious threats involving airplanes in the air and on the ground, and there's been a great deal of media attention continuing in my state on what happened. I don't think we know yet, but I wonder if you could at least comment briefly on the FAA's jurisdiction over this type of incident in the air and on the ground, and the protocols involved, including on the ground. I'm sure you've been following that, yes, and whether you can comment whether those were followed in the air and on the ground.
Yes, sir. You're referring to the flight with the attempted terrorist.
Flight 253.
Flight 253. Yes, sir. We of course, obviously controlled that flight through air traffic control procedures. The controllers, the aircraft landed. They indicated they had a problem. There was a communication gap between the cabin and the flight deck crew. The flight deck crew reported that they had someone who had attempted to set firecrackers off. So it didn't elevate to anyone, whether it was the cockpit or air traffic control, to anything of great seriousness at that point. However, it began to escalate, and if you follow the timeline, we have a very robust system set up with Homeland Security, the Transportation Security Administration. All of those procedures were tracked, followed. We isolated the airplane as soon as it was known to us what we were doing. We also then began very quickly to expand notification. We set up, using our communication system and a domestic events network, we reached out to all of the carriers in the country, explained to them what was going on, and set up procedures so that either we or they could contact their crews to put them on alert of the situation as it developed.
Thank you. Within the jurisdiction of this committee, I look forward to further opportunity to talk about that, and I know there are multiple agencies with multiple jurisdictions. The chairman has been very helpful. We immediately had a closed briefing on the matter involving a number of agencies, but it is of grave concern. I thank God there wasn't a loss of life in that situation, and hopefully this will be another incident that we can learn from. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair thanks the gentleman from Michigan, and now recognizes the gentlelady from West Virginia, Ms. Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the gentleman for their testimony. As we know, it's been a year, and we've met with many of the family members who are here today who have suffered a tragic loss and are moved by their effort to make the sky safer. So we join with them. Certainly hope that we can push the Senate to pass this bipartisan Airline Safety and Improvement Act. First of all, I'd like to say, Administrator Babbitt, I am from West Virginia, and I would like to thank you and your agency's cooperation. As you know, last month a U.S. Airways flight overran the runway, which you don't want to do in West Virginia because we're situated on the top of a mountain. We had 30 passengers and 3 crew members, but because our airport had a EMAS, which is an engineered material arresting system, a new technology that halted the plane on the ramp and saved a lot of lives and a lot of injuries. And I know that the FAA has helped with us in getting the rapid rebuild of that system on our airport. So thank you for that. 2 things I'd like to ask about. The commuting thing that we talked about, we learned in the tragic accident that the commuting times of the pilot, one in particular, was very lengthy, questionable, leading to fatigue. You mentioned commuting, but is it possible to quantify the possible hazards of commuting, and how are you facing this, and how are you interfacing this with the conversation I had with my regional air crew members on Monday, that this is going to be an issue that's going to be very difficult for them as they try to hold their job and live in different areas? So, response.
Well, the primary focus that we have is on crews being rested. We want every crew to show up for work both mentally and physically prepared to go to work. And that's without exception. That is the charge, that is the challenge, and it's our responsibility, a shared responsibility with the crews, to make certain that happens. There has been some focus on the fact that pilots do commute, and that happens. Different carriers handle it different ways. We are literally on the brink, and I hate to be, we've discussed a little bit of the delay issue. It took somewhat longer, not dramatically longer. I sat in this very chair in 1992 and testified on this very subject for the Airline Pilots Association. So I appreciate how long it has taken, but we're talking about a delay that's measured in weeks, not years. So we're very close, and our proposal, our notice of proposed rulemaking, will include a provision where we'll seek comment on what do people believe is the appropriate thing. How can we limit this? I can give you lots of letters that I've received on both sides of this argument. It's a serious issue, but we're focused on fatigue and management of fatigue and recognizing of fatigue, and we've got several ideas as to how to deal with that.
Well, I certainly think, I applaud you for that. I liked it sooner than later, and the fatigue issue is, I'm certain it's hard to quantify. Certainly individuals have different levels of, sustainability with certain hours of sleep. But the other question that came up repeatedly in the last hearing that we had were the major carriers mentoring with the regionals, more seasoned pilots, helping the younger pilots, pairing them. I think we had testimony from numerous people that said the best way to learn after you attain that license is to have somebody right next to you that can show you the ropes and help you meet the difficulties of any kind of situation that you might be in. Is a mentoring program really going to come off here? And is it going to be a situation, this is what I fear, it's going to be a situation that the main carriers who have the more seasoned pilots will, the pilots will say, I'll mentor, but it's going to cost another extra, I want to be compensated for mentoring. This isn't something I'm going to voluntarily do. What is your perspective on that, and also on the pilot pairing, and either one, but the administrator?
No, the mentoring is a natural event over the course of a normal airline. You get hired, you spend a number of years at flying as co-pilot, you learn a lot of things. And that's part of the mentoring process. That's where the experience is built up. One of the things that we're
trying... If I could just interrupt just a second. The plane I was on Monday, I don't know who was mentoring who in the cockpit there. They both look like my 25-year-old children, quite frankly.
Yeah, I was, going back and looking at one of the concerns we have, The model I described for you is a traditional airline that has been around for a long time and has senior pilots to mentor the younger pilots. One of the concerns today is quite often a new airline will form in order to provide service for another carrier, and every pilot at the airline is new. And therefore, how do we ensure that these pilots have had that exposure? Well, we know they meet the regulatory requirements. All of them do. So we've asked the carriers, and I'm very pleased to say that they're all engaging in this. Every carrier in this country today, every mainline carrier that carries passengers, now has a program to exchange their flight ops people with the leadership and the union representatives of the other carrier that feeds them as their regional partner. We want to see how that develops. Is that providing the information transfer that we're looking for? Are there other curriculum courses? Should we introduce this into recurrent training? All of these are areas, but we all recognize the need for it. It's a question of how best to deliver it. We have certainly better academic tools today. We have high-fidelity simulation today. We have science today that we didn't have. So we're going to try and find the best ways to achieve these goals and work with everyone to do that.
Thank you.
Chair thanks the gentlelady and now recognizes the gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to continue the line of questioning that the chairman started. Mr. Babbitt, I appreciate your comment that the fastest way to implement safety improvement program is for it to be done voluntarily. But at the same time, I share the Inspector General's concerns that when that was the case, that some airlines, a lot of them regional airlines, either didn't respond or responded in some kind of vague way. So I haven't really heard from you what you plan to do next, either through the carrot or the stick to get these other airlines to establish these safety programs. And second, I know that many times a program is just written and put on the shelf. Do you have any kind of timeline or any plans to follow up with those airlines that did submit programs to see that they really are being implemented?
That's a very good point, and yes, ma'am. We have, first off, remember that we pressed this into service very quickly. We wanted a very rapid amount of focused attention on everybody in the industry. We wanted to get their attention. And the program, I think, again, a misconception might be that we were going to go out and evaluate all of their programs, and that's not what we asked to be done. We asked to confirm the existence of programs. The follow-on will now be to go back, now that everyone is confirming that, yes, okay, we're going to have these programs, the follow-on is to now go back and say, well, how refined is this program? Are you just filling a square for us, or are you actually developing a program? And we can see some of these programs. Some of them are very robust. Some of them aren't. We'll have to go back with our inspectors. We did hear, remember what we asked these inspectors, again, to do to confirm that there was, in fact, a program, and they did that. We asked them to look at some of the programs. Some of the elements of what we were asked to look at simply don't exist. So, yes, we did get some answers that said this was not applicable or not observable because they may not do that particular maneuver at that carrier. So, yes, we got some vague answers and things, but you need to put them in the context of what our inspectors were looking at. Remember, we have, and I'll put something else in context for you. We use a system of calculated risk. I was part of a review team that went out and reviewed the risk management that we use in this country to ensure the safe levels. And so, we focus on areas. If someone didn't have a program, we put them on notice. You are going to have focused attention. If you don't have a program, you are going to be subjected to further scrutiny from us. And, of course, that's the stick. They usually say, well, you know what, maybe it's a better idea that we get a program. And that's exactly what we want to inspire.
I would just ask the Inspector General to comment on that if you have any suggestions or you think that's going to be adequate or a timeline on which we need to do this.
Thank you, Ms. Titus. Appreciate the opportunity. I would commend FAA under Mr. Babbitt's leadership for pursuing remedial training programs. I'd like to remind the committee that remedial training programs were first suggested in guidance from FAA to the aviation industry in 2006. It was suggested, it was put on record as guidance at that point. It wasn't mandated. Yet under the urgency of the call to action initiative which again I give credit to Mr. Babbitt for initiating, it was discovered that a sizable number of airlines at that point didn't yet have remedial training programs. They do now. So they have certainly checked the box, to use Mr. Babbitt's phrase. They have something on the shelf, to use your phrase, and we would encourage FAA diligently to follow up sooner rather than later in evaluating the effectiveness of those programs. And the guidance that FAA headquarters provides to its inspectors in the field will be absolutely key.
Thank you.
Chair thanks the gentlelady and now recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, I wanted to kind of clarify what I was stating earlier, because I still believe this is about quality of training and not quantity of training. And I heard two comments about this isn't just about the number of hours. And I agree with that, because we have other things in here, obviously high-altitude training, weather training, besides being an ATP. But being an ATP, that is the biggest limiting factor here, because it takes 1,500 hours. And all due respect to the statement that was made earlier, a combat veteran who's got 300 hours in a plane and all the training in the world isn't just learning how to fly. They're a very qualified individual, and I do not want to limit this to folks that only have 1,500 hours with an ATP certificate. Getting an ATP certificate doesn't make you a good pilot. What makes you a good pilot is a whole lot of other things that are out there. We need to be concentrating more on hiring practices with some of the airlines and weeding some of these folks out that do not belong in the cockpit. And every person in this room that's a pilot knows there are people in the cockpit today who do not belong there. And I don't want them commanding an aircraft that I've got my family on, even if they have an ATP certificate and have had high-altitude training and icing training and severe weather training and everything else. But there are also people out there that have had 500 hours or 750 hours who have been trained in some very capable schools or military trained, who are very qualified to sit in the right seat and move along through the process. But I understand what what we're talking about here, and I know it isn't just about the number of hours. But the fact of the matter is, that's a huge limiting factor on the folks out there that we should have in the cockpit as that backup person, is that right seater. Now, as far as the question, that was a statement, obviously. I am curious, and I think, Mr. Babbitt, you gave me the answer, too. Obviously, just a commercial certificate isn't enough, and you mentioned that. Number of hours, total number of hours, though, I think you mentioned 750. Is that just did you throw that out, or is that actually a recommendation?
In our advance notice, I believe that's the number we put in. That's 3 times the amount of time. But with that goes a requirement to have a number of training elements and academic requirements. So it's not just accruing 250 times 3.
Right.
It's accruing more flight time and accruing a portfolio of education, exposure, high-fidelity training. If I could, I'll give you an example. In 1974, I was a fairly young, imagine that, co-pilot for Eastern Airlines. And we merged with an airline called Rayburn. And Rayburn flew exclusively out of San Juan, Puerto Rico, all through the Caribbean, as you might guess from the name. They integrated into our seniority list. And I began to fly with the Rayburn pilot. They were excellent pilots. I flew with 25-year veterans. But I was surprised when I first went to New York with the Rayburn pilot who had never seen snow fall on an airplane. 25 years of experience, 15,000 hours. The pilot wasn't trained for the mission. Conversely, we began to fly in their operations. My entire life, I had flown East Coast, a lot of weather, a lot of approaches, and suddenly we're in a day VFR, unradar-controlled environment. I wasn't trained for that mission either. I had plenty of time, but this is what I'm trying to shed the light on, is just accruing the hours doesn't necessarily assure us that you have been exposed to the things that I personally believe. And I would tell you the simplest thing I could say is, sure, 1,500 hours, let's just move on, 1,500. I don't believe that. I believe that we need more than the 1,500. I'm not ruling out 1,500. I believe people need more training elements, and we need to know that they have received them, not that we think they received them just because they had a lot of flight time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair thanks the gentleman and now recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Richardson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'd like to commend Mr. Babbitt. I think from the time when you came in, you acknowledged the long delays that were clearly not your responsibility and your fault. However, you took the responsibility for them and committed to begin work immediately. And I've been here now a little less than 3 years, and that's the most glowing recommendation I've ever heard from Mr. Scovel. So I think I'm sure he didn't intend it as a recommendation, I understand that, but I think the comments acknowledge at least some of the initial work that needed to be done. In light of that, however, Mr. Scovel in his testimony has said very specifically that the FAA has not implemented key rulemakings on new crew fatigue and training requirements. The FAA special investigations of air carrier training programs were ineffectively designed and implemented. And then the other key one that I wanted to highlight that he noted is that FAA has missed its milestone for establishing programs to improve pilot professionalism. And although you've talked about some delays, I think for the American flying public, tolerance is not acceptable. And it's not okay to say that we're doing better. We have to fix it, and we have to fix it now. So, Mr. Babbitt, what would be your response to Mr. Scovel's testimony?
Well, first, I have a great deal of respect for the General, and I have a great deal of respect for their observations. I find them very helpful. Obviously, I can't watch everything that the FAA does. I have my own goals, and we try to do things, and I appreciate that they can put some bright lights on some things that we haven't done so well. And we take those things that they suggest to us very seriously. So I appreciate.
But do you agree with them?
Let me take the fatigue as an example. I came to the FAA 4 months after this accident happened. I've been here 7.5, 8 months. In that 8 months, we have promulgated 4 rules. I have outlined a number of things that we have done, and I've really tried to convince people, or at least shed some light on, in that 8 months, we're going to release a rule here in another month. This is a very deliberative process, and rulemaking is a deliberative process. Making legislation is a deliberative process. The work that the NTSB does. This accident happened a year ago. It took a year to have the hearing. It's a deliberative process. I appreciate what they go through.
Mr. Babbitt, I apologize. Being a relatively new member, I only have 2.5 minutes. And my question is, do you agree with Mr. Scovel's assessments? And although things do take a while, I will also tell you that as a new member, I sat as many as my colleagues did when we got a call from Secretary Paulson and Vernakian saying the sky was crumbling and we had to react, and we had to react in 2 days. Mm-hmm. So sometimes, depending upon the issue, the reaction has to be different. So do you or do you not agree with the testimony of Mr. Scovel, which are not just limited to rulemaking? And now I have 1 minute and 47 seconds.
All right, in 15 seconds, I get an A+ on milestones for professionalism. Training, I get an incomplete, and I get a B on fatigue.
But do you agree with his assessment?
I agree with some of his assessments, yes, I do.
Okay. We look forward to your immediate reaction to them, and I would say I would rather see you come to us and be creative and think out of the box and maybe have to figure out how we can do things differently, because I think the confidence of the American public is reducing every day that we delay, and I think there's room for us to think creatively and do it different. And I'd look forward to helping you. Thank you,
Thank you
sir.
very much. I appreciate that.
I thank the gentlelady and now recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Bucheri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Babbitt and Mr. Scovel, for attending this hearing today. Mr. Babbitt, I've spoken to you offline a number of times, and I appreciate the professionalism that you're bringing to the agency and your sense of urgency to tackle some of these big issues that should have been addressed decades before your arrival here before this committee today. And I want to just stress some things that I think are very key to this discussion that we're having right now. Number one, we're talking about pilot experience, and we're talking about something that is even proposed in the notice, the NPRMs by the FAA, to train like you fly and fly like you train. These were very experienced pilots by some measure, 5,600 hours between them, but even the best pilots who have hundreds of thousands of hours, if they climb into an airplane and they are not trained on the safety procedures and the safety equipment in that airplane, I don't care who they are. They're going to have trouble recognizing and implementing recovery procedures. And in fact, the NTSB report suggests that the Q400 check pilots interviewed demonstrated instruction of the aircraft pusher system is not even part of the training syllabus at Colgan Air. In 1991, 2002, 04, 05, 06, 07, the captain of this airplane failed his check rides. Incomplete, lack of retraining, of remedial training. This was a tragic accident, but it was completely avoidable, in my opinion. Since 1973, the NTSB has been required and asking the FAA to implement procedures that advises the training and stall recovery should go beyond the approach to a stall to include stall training recovery from a full stall condition. The NTSB has further said that these are open and unacceptable responses by the FAA. Now, all this happened before you got there. But the Inspector General just reported that over the last year, a year later, the FAA has not finalized the rule as established for training requirements as established in the call to action. Since 1973, the NTSB has had a call to action. In the last year, nothing has happened, even though in October, this Congress and the U.S. House of Representatives passed a resolution suggesting that they will recognize and avoid a stall of an aircraft and it will require simulation. So I want to know why, after a year, after decades, we are not having any movement with respect to this, sir.
Well, it's a very valid question. And one of the things, if I could take you through the timeline, a year ago, January, the new rules that cover training were submitted and comments were taken. The volume of comments was absolutely incredible. 3,000 pages of observations came in, and they range from training procedures, better ideas, questions about what we were proposing, lack of technical capability to actually do them. Simulators don't necessarily do everything that an airplane can do. And so if you ask someone to do this in a simulator and the simulator is not capable of doing that, then someone would raise their hand and say, well, we can't do that because the simulator won't replicate it. However, we're on the verge of today's high-fidelity simulation actually can. And I think, and I know you're a seasoned pilot yourself, we wouldn't put people in a real airplane in harm's way. I've actually done a full stall in a 777. It's one of the most violent maneuvers I think I've ever been in an airplane, number one. And number two, it damages the airplane. Sure. I mean, you wouldn't never sell that airplane after you full stall it. It's so big. But that doesn't mean we can't simulate it, and that's what this rule proposes. We put a supplemental out, or a supplemental will be going out, and I look forward to having that out also this spring and put this to bed.
Well, we need to put it to bed after decades and decades of non-action by the FAA with respect to this. In fact, the NTSB has said that the issues in the Colgan investigation are not new ones or unique to regional airlines. And in fact, when they further pressed Colgan, why they didn't even have a part of their safety features of this airplane as part of their curriculum, they suggested the FAA didn't require it. So where we've seen these regional airlines who are now doing more takeoff and landings than our large airlines around the country, they have met and exceeded them in the past. They are now shooting for the minimums. And I find this completely unacceptable when the minimums don't include in any of the training syllabuses requirement for understanding and recognizing and recovering with the safety features that are on the airplane. So the Congress is moving. I expect the FAA to move too, sir, and you have done a good job of moving and shaking and showing the sense of urgency. But it is very clear in here that this will be part of simulation, and we're not going to rest until this is not passed. So I look forward to further committee hearings where we press this. Thank you, Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you. Being exceedingly new to this job, just 3 months, I understand your situation. But when I looked at your name, I thought perhaps I'd gone back to where I was in the mid-'90s with Secretary Babbitt when I was his deputy secretary. We did a lot of rulemaking at that time, and it's a process that can be exceedingly slow. Have you set out a definitive timeline?
With regard to the fatigue rule, yes, sir. And I will offer you the same apologies that I offered this committee. We set a timeline. I asked for a timeline that we would have a rule out by the end of 2009. I was overly ambitious. I was not aware, and we ran into some technical issues. It is an incredibly complex rule. This, for the first time, we're going to take science into consideration. We're taking input from both the managements that run the carriers as well as the pilots themselves and the various unions involved. So it took us longer. We do plan to have it out this spring, which will be 8 months from when I indicated we would try it.
I'm really not surprised. My own experience at writing rules is that the unanticipated is guaranteed to happen. And the delays will always be more than you anticipate. Therefore, my question goes to the legislation that this committee has passed, that the House has passed, and is now in the Senate. Do you support that legislation?
I do. A number. If you go through and look at the elements that we tried to advance, we certainly took a great deal of guidance from the legislation. We thought that we could perhaps move these things along. I understand that legislation itself is a deliberative process, and if we could be moving these things in parallel, I expressed privately to the chairman, I would love to say, we just passed all these things, and thank you, the FAA got them done. Thank you. I would love for that to happen. So we're working pretty robustly.
You do support the legislation publicly and in the Senate?
Well, I haven't been asked by the Senate, but yes, sir. We support the goals that you have set forth here, yes.
Do you support the legislation then? You do support the legislation?
Yes, sir, I do.
Very good. I think you may find that as slow as the Senate is, it may be faster than the regulatory process.
Well, as our goal here, what's interesting, I think everybody, certainly the Inspector General, who I have a great deal of respect for, this committee, everybody, we all have the same goal. We all want to improve safety. The NTSB, and they can be critical of us from time to time, but I respect that. We need that attention. But I would note, when we talk about deliberative process, I just got a set of recommendations 2 weeks ago on my desk from the NTSB from an accident that happened 3 years ago. It's a deliberative process for them, too. I just got the recommendations from a 3-year-old accident. So all of us have this process. We'd love to move it faster. I think we all share the common goal of safety.
Well, there are some elements in all of these issues that are common and agreed to, and for which there is relevant and information readily available now. Those might move ahead, while others that have unknowns and need additional information may be left out for a later time. Are you considering that process as you go through your rulemaking proposals?
Yes, sir, and I think if you, and I'd love to talk to you when we have more time, and I'd be happy to, but one of the things that we have tried to do was take and use, in Chairman Oberstar's words, the bully pulpit, to get people to do things voluntarily with a lot of pressure and a lot of visibility. I published the names of every carrier who didn't respond to us. We made them public. You would turn us down at your risk if you chose not to comply. So we did as much as we could do voluntarily, because we could do that quickly and put many of the things that we're trying to do with regulation or with the help of your legislation are in place, but we wanted as much as we could get done on a voluntary basis to take immediate action.
My point is more than that, is that my experience in writing regulations is that sometimes it's better to separate issues and to write one set of regulations for things that can be done immediately, for which there is knowledge and information, and then hold the other piece. Sometimes if you wait for the last piece, there are going to be a lot of dead people. Thank you.
Chair thanks the gentleman, and now recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. DeFazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Scovel, in your testimony where you're talking about the special inspections air carrier training programs were ineffectively designed and implemented, I find some disturbing elements in there, and I'd like you to expand on them a little bit, and then I'll ask Administrator Babbitt to respond. It says FAA we're talking about responses, only capture no responses, any roll-up analysis. A true evaluation of the air carrier training program should have included a review of the program's effectiveness, not just compliance with requirements, i.e. we checked the boxes, but did it work, did we get the desired result? what sort of measures should there be? I mean, how would we get to measuring the effectiveness? How would the FAA do that, and why don't they do it?
Sir, we have a project underway at the request of the Congress to assess FAA's determination of the validity of training programs, and we intend to follow up on that point. On this key one, I'll note that two aspects. The first goes to a point that Mr. Baccieri raised earlier, and that is the poor performing pilot and the pilot in the Colgan crash who repeatedly failed certain training evolutions. The direction to FAA inspectors in the field in phase 1 of this focused inspection initiative was to assess how carriers are able to identify, track, and manage low-time pilots and poor-performing pilots. FAA issued specific guidance to its inspectors in the field on how to define a low-time pilot. Right. FAA didn't issue any guidance to inspectors on how they should identify whether carriers are properly following poor-performing pilots. As a result, when my team went out to the field, we found disparate approaches between inspectors at different locations. How did one team identify poor performers? How did the other? It calls into question the validity of that part of this initiative.
Well, in fact, I think you said elsewhere that in the regional airlines that few of them have an automated system to track poor performance and or prevent pairing of two poor performance pilots. Is that correct?
That's true for scheduling purposes, yes,
and
sir.
Are we going to be, are there requirements, coming along, they're going to make them establish systems, since some of our regional airlines, the better ones, have figured out how to do that? I mean, why do we allow these other substandard ones to continue? Mr. Babbitt, can you respond to that? Mr. Babbitt?
Yes, sir. One of the things...
I would assume Colgan probably falls in the category of not having that program.
And you're absolutely right. We have a safety advisory for flight operations that addresses this and recommends that everyone, and it gives them the basics of this. But what our
recommends or requires?
The call to action at that point in time, which was, me 6 weeks on the job, the call to action was to go out and find out who has these programs and who doesn't have them. Just find the existence of the programs and put scrutiny on those who don't. The good news is they now have all begun to move that direction. And I mentioned earlier in testimony, you might not have been in here, that our next phase of this is to now go back and evaluate the actual program. What are the elements you're tracking, and let us make certain that we have a good, solid program in place, and we'll audit that. But the good news is now they all have a program. How robust it is remains to be seen.
Okay, so, that doesn't give me tremendous confidence. I mean, it is an improvement, but, we need some sort of reportable metrics, it seems to me, from, how many pilots they've identified that have performance problems. There should be some sort of requirement, seems to me, that what steps they're taking, or have taken with those pilots in order to give them remedial training, or perhaps to curtail their duty, or only pair them as co-pilots, or, what sort of steps they're taking actively once they've identified problem people. And that seems to me there should be some burden on the airlines. Identify these people, track them, and report to us what you've got and what you're doing about it. Are you envisioning that?
Yes, sir. I couldn't agree with you more. And I do think, one of the things that we've said all along, I think part of what will come of this in time is increased responsibility on behalf of the carriers. Yes, in this case, we've identified some errors that pilots made. But there's an obligation on the carriers to make certain that they have the quality training, that the tools are out there. And it's our obligation to make certain that they provide the highest standard we possibly can. So it's a burden on all of us.
And I would go a little further, and I'm not sure what you mean by carriers. In this case, we have a contract carrier for a major airline. I would say the responsibility goes to both the contract carrier and to the major airline. There should be some responsibility. Instead of going for the lowest bidder, there's some responsibility for them to determine that this lowest bidder is actually a qualified bidder. And I don't think we really have that kind of system now, except for the market-based system where people say, they lost, they've got a crummy, regional carrier. I think I'll stay away from that airline.
Right. and I appreciate, and we've certainly gotten a lot of comment and dialogue on that issue. I do think when we talk about, the carriage rights and those types of things, we're on the safety side. Those agreements made between commercial operations are probably at a higher level of the Department of Transportation.
Right, but at least notification. I mean, we've fought over this for years. It's like you think you bought a ticket on Continental, but actually you're flying this leg with Colgan. I just at least that level of disclosure I think would be useful, and perhaps I don't know whether that's within the jurisdiction of the FAA or directly, or whether that comes from some other party.
There is a requirement, but the requirement is rather small and often after the fact, where when you arrive at the gate, they're obliged to tell you with notification that it's being operated by.
Yeah, it's a little late at that point, Precisely. I mean, you're kind of far. I mean, I think the original idea was people would be notified at the time of booking. Isn't that correct, Mr. Chairman? And so I guess we need to figure out a way to translate that. Because what I want to do is I want to advantage and benefit those regional carriers that are doing better and not allow them to be outcompeted and drugged down by the ones who aren't. And that's the system we have today, lowest common denominator rules. That's a problem I've had with both the RTA and the big association, the ATA, and I've said that to a number of their directors over the years. You do not benefit your high-performing airlines by representing the lowest value people in your organization. I know you want their dues, but these other people, we need to be bringing them up, not dragging other people down. The current system drags other people down, and we've got to fix that problem. Part of that is why we're arguing over hours and training and that, so that they can't shortcut there. But part of it goes to some of these other things, which are, there's got to be some chain of responsibility here. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chair thanks you, and you're correct in your assumption about the bill that we have passed out of the House. It does two things. Number one, there's a provision that says truth in advertising, and it mandates that the internet websites that sell airline tickets disclose to the purchaser on the first page of the website the air carrier that operates each segment of the flight, and we also make them printed on the ticket as well. So the chair thanks the gentleman and now recognizes the gentle lady from Texas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I apologize for being late, but Dr. Ellers and I have been running between committees. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to put my opening remarks in the record.
Without objection.
And Administrator Babbitt, I know that your hands are probably full, but keep in mind that people are increasingly concerned about flying, and yet we don't want to see that stop. Could you tell me what your review entails when you review the crew member training, the qualifications, and management practices?
Sure. One of the areas that we're very focused on, and we're actually working with Congress and this committee on, is to remove the possibility that someone in the hiring process doesn't have, or someone who is responsible for the hiring, for the acquisition of a new pilot, that that person, he or she, has a complete record of this pilot's history. And that would include the pilot's military history, their history within the FAA, their history at other air carriers. We realized, unfortunately, through tragedies, that wasn't always the case, and we passed the PREA Act, which is the Pilot Record Improvement Act, which gives the carriers that. But we left an unintended consequence there, that the pilot has to, because of freedom of information issues, the pilot has to give people the permission to do that. And so we're trying to work with a way so that there should be one place where you can say, I'm about to hire this pilot. I would like to know their entire record. We have uniform traffic violations. You can see if I got a speeding ticket in Texas and I got another one in Virginia, it's going to show up. And that's what we want to see here. If someone has had a problem we've seen is they say, oh, well, they failed one check ride. That's not so bad. They failed one in the military. They failed two in front of the FAA. They failed two more at their last carrier. That's a trend. And that's what we need to be able to put light on.
Thank you. Now, do you focus strictly on pilots?
These bills, and yes, ma'am, this is focused on pilot hiring.
Because other crew members should have some training standards as well. Mr. Scovel, you made the statement that you cannot regulate professionalism, and you're exactly right. But what action, if any, can FAA and the industry take to address the key safety concerns?
Ms. Johnson, thank you. I think my statement in my oral statement was we cannot mandate professionalism. My written statement says regulate. There's a little bit of difference there, and to draw that distinction more finely, I think that certain key aspects of professional behavior can be regulated, and on occasion should be. Mr. Babbitt has outlined a voluntary approach, a consensus-building approach to enhance professionalism across the aviation industry through all pilots, and we certainly endorse that. We would urge the agency as well when significant safety problems are identified in the professionalism area that regulation be considered truly as a tool in the toolkit rather than exclusive reliance on a consensus or voluntary approach.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks to gentlelady, and it's good to see you back with us. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Dr. Ehlers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I apologize as the gentlewoman from Texas has. We were both in another committee, and I also had a markup going on. I did want to comment on something that disturbed me very much. I read most of the transcript and all the important parts of the Colgan incident, and I was just absolutely astounded and dismayed at the lack of professionalism that was displayed in the transcript. And I think that is a very key factor. Now, I am familiar with some pilots who have gone to probably the best aviation school in the country, perhaps in the world. And I won't name it because I'll get in trouble with everyone else. But I'm just very impressed at the knowledge that this person has and the ability. And this person did fly in the industry for some time and left for various reasons. But when talking to this person about it, it was just astounded that anyone would be allowed in a cockpit that displayed the lack of professionalism and the lack of confidence that the Colgan pilots did. The question I think we have to worry about is how do you teach professionalism? I'm not sure you can. How do you communicate it? I think you can do that by example. And perhaps the best way is that the right seat person trains with excellent pilots in the left seat who have exhibited a teaching ability, a teaching skill, and even if they're not part of the same particular airline, but usually it's airlines are related. So perhaps a commuter airline candidate would fly with some of the larger planes for a brief time and just observe what the experienced and well-trained pilots do. And I'm sure, for example, that we know that the current administrator of the FAA was an Airline Pilots Association, and I've talked to him about the good old days when I used to be able to fly in the cockpit, as the rest of our committee was. And it was just so clear, the incredible professionalism of the average pilot in the airline industry. And perhaps maybe the candidates for positions have to ride for half a year in the jump seat of a large jet and watch how carefully and thoughtfully the experienced pilots operate and the professionalism that they have. I don't think you can teach professionalism in a class. You can teach responsibility and then give them the opportunity to work directly or observe directly well-trained pilots who've been in the business a long time. I think that would certainly do a lot more than requiring more hours would, because if a pilot is not well-trained, you can require more hours, but they'll just practice the same bad habits. So having rambled for a bit, I would just appreciate the comments of either of our witnesses on the points I've raised and potential solution I've offered. Mr. Babbitt?
Dr. Ehlers, thank you very much. I share your views. And one thing I'd like to clear up, we've made a lot of observations. Right now, today, over this country, we're going to have about 50,000 flights. That will mean thousands, tens of thousands of airline pilots are going to be flying those flights. Men and women that do this day in, day out, they're going to carry 2 million people, and they're incredibly professional. We got to see a very bad exposure that resulted in a tragedy from less than professional. But so many of the crews conduct themselves professionally, and my goal in this strive for professionalism and putting it in front of them is to make everybody in the cockpit aware. When we have a sterile cockpit violation, there are 2 people in a conversation. Otherwise, it would be a monologue. And what I want is when one person violates the sterile cockpit rule, the other person says, "Excuse me, we're below 10,000. We'll conduct this on the ground." Or, "Let's finish this climb. We'll talk about this when we get out of the sterile environment." Somebody has to be reminded. And what we've had is, in some cases, lapses like we've seen. And it's put the bright light on it. I think we can do a lot with training. I think we can do a lot by simply bringing it to their attention. You used a phrase I like, and that is, you repeat bad habits. Practice just makes permanent. What we want is to practice the right thing and show people the right procedures and the right way to be a professional in the cockpit. And that's what these programs we're trying to do today. And I think we're going to bear fruit with it. I see a lot of interest in it. I know myself, we didn't have to ride for half a year, but we had to ride for about a half a month. When I was a new pilot, we had to just sit in the jump seat and watch the crew for our first half a month on the line, to watch a crew. Today, they have initial operating experience. They actually sit in the seat. But those type of programs, we can find what works better and enhance them and expand on them. But I completely agree with you.
Mr. Scovel?
I would agree with Mr. Babbitt on this point. Mentoring, leadership by example. I think all of us in our professional lives can look back, no matter what our field is, and recognize the value that kind of experience has brought to us in enhancing our own professionalism. I think NTSB's point, however, is also a good one in its report on the Colgan crash released just day before yesterday, and that is that specific aspects of behavior, like leadership training, like workload management, ought to be required by mandate in carriers' training programs. Mm-hmm. Key, too, I think, is the fact that we're victims today of all the many potentially distracting electronic devices that are available to us. And most unfortunately, in the Colgan crash, there's evidence that the first officer had been text messaging when she should have been observing the sterile cockpit rule. Now, she wasn't called on it by her pilot, but if there were a rule banning such devices from the flight deck, as NTSB has recommended now, perhaps she would have followed that rule. Again, no guarantees, but as part of a rule, as part of training, as part of follow-up by a diligent pilot, maybe that particular aspect of the Colgan crash wouldn't have been happened or recorded.
Yes, although given the transcript I read, I'm not sure it would have helped that much. Let me just say what I was trying to get at when talking about having them observe pilots. I don't think it would help much for a Colgan pilot to observe another Colgan pilot if there is a problem there already. I'm talking about having them observe a pilot who has 5,000 hours or something and knows the rules very well and follows them. And most anyone who is in charge of the pilots would know who is best at that, who is not a grumpy pilot and wouldn't sort of snarl at the newcomers, would be very friendly and enjoy teaching, etc. Wouldn't be too hard to identify those, and I think that would be a real plus. Thank you. I yield back.
Chair, you yield back. The chair thanks the gentleman and now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Petri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to have a question of General Scovel following up on a concern expressed by Mr. DeFazio and others about how you have a competitive industry under a lot of economic pressure and yet have a framework that protects and ensures safety rather than people being put under increasing pressure to cut corners, and the result is what we all fear, and that is that we have increase in accidents and loss of life. And that the industry itself has a kind of a hierarchical relationship. There are the international carriers and the national carriers, and then there are the people who subcontract with sometimes with one, sometimes with more than one carrier to provide regional service and so on. Should we be building on that and relying on the major carriers to regulate the regionals, or should we be making sure the federal government regulates everyone and maybe also regulates the way they contract with each other? I don't know. I mean, do you have some comment on how we can deal with this hierarchical situation and the pressure it's putting on some of the performance of the regionals?
Mr. Petri, tough question. Let me take a stab at it. First, we have to acknowledge that by statute, FAA's primary mission is aviation safety. So that reach must extend throughout the aviation carriers that are under the jurisdiction of the FAA. The committee may recall that about 10 years ago, at the Congress's request, my office did work concerning the responsibilities of U.S. carriers with regard to their international code share partners. At that point, the concern was, again, that there were safety lapses and U.S. carriers had no role or no responsibility in seeing that those were mitigated. The rules have changed now, and U.S. carriers do indeed have an obligation to at least audit the safety programs and the training programs, the maintenance programs of their international code share partners. And that's a model that I think may have led to Chairman Oberstar's and Chairman Costello's request to my office yesterday that we examine on the domestic market whether U.S. mainline carriers may have such or should have such a relationship with their domestic regional partners as well. We just got the request yesterday. We'll certainly turn to on it most expeditiously. We hope to have some information and data that will be helpful to the committee as it considers that point.
Well, it's complicated because sometimes it's not just one carrier, and you may have it can't be whatever. It may be an additional safety, but you couldn't think it could be a primary delegation of oversight or whatever.
Yeah.
I don't know. You're going to have to respond to that question, but this is a concern. Whether there should be one regulator or there should be multiple regulators, some hierarchy of regulation. We really would appreciate your thoughts on how we should be making sure we get to the highest common denominator rather than this flight to the bottom that we all fear in a competitive economic environment.
I understand, and we will do our best to bring you that information, Mr. Petri.
Chair, thanks the ranking member, and let me thank you, General Scovel, for your good work. As always, you've testified before the subcommittee many times, and we give you plenty of work to do, and I can assure you that we will continue to do that as we sent our latest request into you yesterday. Administrator Babbitt, let me commend you. I said earlier, I know that there are people, including myself, who get frustrated because of the process and the time that it takes to get something done. But as I said earlier, that I've dealt with a number of administrators since I've been on this subcommittee, and you have acted very quickly, and given the fact that the bureaucracy is as it is, you've had some success because of your action. We are seeing the airlines voluntarily do some things that they should have been doing on their own before. And we trust that you will follow up, as we will, this subcommittee will, to make certain that what the airlines have agreed to do, that they in fact follow up and carry out. Let me also say that in spite of your best efforts, it's going to take legislation to address some of these issues. And that's why we introduced our legislation. I'm pleased that you indicated, and you and I have met several times about a number of issues in the legislation. I'm pleased that you stated today your support for the legislation, and I would hope that, as I said, the Senate will act so that we can move forward and actually pass some legislation, get to conference, and get it to the President. So I appreciate your support, and we trust that you'll continue to work with us to perfect any legislation that we might bring through the Congress. To the families, let me say again, thank you for being here today. We appreciate your continued support. We appreciate the fact that you take time out of your lives to be here to push this legislation and to push us, not only the agency, the FAA, but the Congress into action. And I would encourage you as well to contact your United States senators to encourage them to address the airline pilot and safety issues that we have put in our bill, and to stress the importance that they need to act so that we can, in fact, move legislation and move it into law. So let me, again, thank you, Mr. Scovel, Administrator Babbitt, for being here, and that concludes this hearing. Subcommittee stands adjourned.